Well, I think I was very fortunate that I came across Henry George in my teens and read his probably most famous book, Progress and Poverty, that was published in 1879. And he very, very clearly identified land as being a critical issue in the way that the economy works. And even though people nowadays sometimes say, well, that was an agrarian economy and so on, actually it wasn't. He was talking about a developing economy in San Francisco, and the importance that he placed on land and its role in everything from the creation of poverty, the creation of poor working conditions, and indeed the generation of economic boom and bust. He put all of that together in quite a strong moral framework. So I think his ideas have inspired a lot of people, and so certainly they did inspire me, even though I think some of the language now isn't immediately accessible to people. But it's a great book.
And it is. The actions you're taking is, as Gandhi said, it's like being the change you would like to see in the world. What is that change? What would you like to see that's different than what it is today?
Well, I guess that my ultimate aim would be to see a world in which everybody paid a ground rent for the land or for the natural resources that they use, and that this would generate enough revenue that we could do without the taxes which do such damage to our economy, taxes on jobs and employment and value added and so on. So I'd like to see that both in terms of economic efficiency and also in terms of fairness, because at the moment we have a world that's divided up into one group of people who own the land and natural resources and receive rent from that, and another group of people who are excluded from that, who have to pay rent to live, to survive, to have a home, to have somewhere to work. So I'd like to see a world in which that happens. And that sounds pretty remote, but in practical terms, I'd simply like to start by seeing a reform of the council tax, which is an outrageously unfair tax on people who live in low-value homes. And I'd like to see a reform of business rates, which fall on properties that are being well used and more or less exempt properties that are derelict and unused and so on. So the whole incentive structure for making good use of land is turned upside down in the business rates. So in practical terms, I'd just like to see some reform of the council tax and business rates and replacing those with something with a land value tax.
If we lived in a world where all landowners paid the full ground rent, what would that world look like?
Well, that's a very big question, because it would be very different from the world that we're in at the moment. I think that the one big difference would be around the way that land is used and land is allocated, because at the moment it makes sense for people to basically take on the ownership of as much land as they can, even if they're not going to put it to tremendously good use. And I think that one of the things that would happen in a world in which you've got land value taxation is that all of the land would be put to really good use. And the fact that people were faced with the choice between either paying their ground rent or handing their property on to somebody else who would make better use of it, or making better use of it themselves, means that the sort of sites that are currently underused or derelict would be brought into use, and that would make land more available for everybody, for housing, for work, and so on. So there's the land use aspect. There's an economic aspect, which is that at the moment the ground rent of land, whether it's paid or whether it's simply imputed by, whether it's simply something that landowners don't have to pay to anybody else, is accumulated by landowners who are one part of society, and that if everybody was paying ground rent and if this was used for the benefit of all, then that advantage of landowners would change, and that would lead to a more equal society. It depends rather what you do with the revenue, but if landowners did that, then it would spread out the wealth created in our complex economy in a very different sort of way. And the impacts on the economy, for example, if you use the revenue as a source of revenue for government, or at least use some of it for that, then you could reduce existing taxes, and that would benefit people who are currently paying taxes, and a lot of those, of course, are the poorest people. So there's those effects on the economy as a whole, and then that goes right the way up through the economy. It has impacts on the economy as a whole, because at the moment people invest in land and in houses particularly, and we see repeated cycles of boom and bust as house prices and land prices rise and soar above what they can really sustain and then crash. And so land is a major cause of the economic disruptions that capitalist societies have grown used to over the course of the last couple of centuries. And then there are all sorts of just very practical things, like it provides a way of capturing the increase in land value that occurs when there is public investment by the government. If we build a railway, then the values of, if it's built in a sensible place, then the values of residential land around the stations will rise, because people can travel more easily to work or to commerce and jobs and so on. And so at the moment what happens is that the government invests in infrastructure, and landowners around that area are the ones who benefit. With the land value tax, that their ground rents would go up, they would contribute that, and it would either go back to the government to fund more infrastructure, or to provide a subsidy for the building and running of that infrastructure. And it's not just things like railways and fast broadband and so on, but you could use the same understanding for things like schools and education and healthcare and so on, because if you look at the values of the prices of houses around schools that have a particular catchment areas, you'll find that schools that admit children from a particular area, if they're a good school, then the house prices around there are higher. And at the moment, it's if a school built up its quality, then the people who benefit are the homeowners around. Whereas if that revenue went back to the government, to the state, then we begin to see all sorts of beneficial spending that is currently regarded as being a drain on the economy, as actually being investment in a viable and thriving economy as well as society. So it changes the whole way you think about public spending.
Wow, that is truly comprehensive. That's a lot of things coming out of one kind of action. I'm just going to focus on one aspect of that. It's one of the least intuitive claims made about LVT and the economic theories of Henry George. And that is that it would have a significant impact on employment, on the availability of work, wages, working conditions, etc. Can you home in a little on that and tell us how the paying of LVT could have an impact in that manner?
Well, I think that one fairly straightforward way in which it would do that is by changing the tax structure. That if the government has a source of revenue from ground rents, from a land value tax, then most people who advocate this would suggest using that revenue to remove existing taxes. Because if you look at a tax, all taxes discourage whatever's being taxed, and at the moment we spread our taxes around all sorts of things that actually we'd like to encourage, really. We discourage jobs with national insurance contributions and to some extent with income tax. We discourage people from adding value by taxing value added. We discourage people from making profits because we tax corporation tax. So all the sorts of things that actually we'd like to see going on in the economy, at the moment we discourage, and those reduce jobs, because if you have to pay insurance, national insurance contributions and income tax for your employees, then you can't employ as many people. So through the tax system and through reviving the economy, removing the deadweight loss of taxation, that would be one way in which this approach changes the nature of employment and the availability of employment. There's also the impact of making available land. At the moment, there are very, very few places where you can sort of go and find somewhere to work without paying any rent at all. So the first hurdle you have to encounter, whatever your work is, unless you're sort of doing it in a public space, is to pay the rent of the owner of the land. And as land becomes less attractive to hold, it becomes the market rents of land falls. There even possibly becomes some land that nobody really wants to hold on to any longer, because of the cost of bearing it if it's not bringing in income. So I think it makes a lot of land available for all manner of things, for housing, for work, for employment. And then, I mean, you also talked about changing the nature of the conditions of labour and so on. The other way I believe that you'd need to use this revenue is not just for reforming the tax system, which is pretty problematic, but also for reforming the benefit system, which also has its deep iniquities, and replacing the existing benefit system with a universal income. Now, once you have a universal basic income, that changes the nature of the relationship between people and employers, because everybody then already has a secure private income that they can rely on. That changes the nature of how desperate people are to work and so on. So I think it completely changes the nature of why you work, and it changes the way in which we share out what's produced in our very, very complex economy, which at the moment is pretty unsatisfactory.
Okay, so all of that is impressive, has a potential impact, but what we're talking about is what would happen if everyone was paying it, if everyone was paying full market rent, ground rent of their land. So what's the relationship between that and a handful of people making a voluntary ground rent contribution?
Yes, pretty distant, isn't it? I mean, I think that there are probably two answers to that, really. One of them is that if you really believe that something's the right way for the world to be, then one possible response is just to take one small step and say, well, let's just try it. Just like John did when he came into the pub and said, let's just try it. Let's just do our bit. And I suppose there's always a bit of a hope in the background that if one person starts, or two people start, or a small group of people start, then it'll spread. So I suppose that's one side of an answer. The other side of an answer is that it frankly, when I describe it to people, they think it's crazy to start off with, and it means they start asking questions. Yes, well, why would you pay tax? Why would you pay a tax voluntarily? It's a version of the question that politicians always say about land value tax. Well, how can I ask my constituents to pay a tax to live in their own home? So it's not an intuitive thing to support unless you really understand what the potential consequences are. So the interesting thing about those sort of conversations of people who are surprised by this as an initiative is that it leads to questions. It leads to questions about property rights, about ownership, about the way the government raises revenue, about how we could, if we chose to, together, implement a land value tax and produce a world that would be much more conducive to all of us to live in.
Sounds good. Is there anything else, something that I haven't asked you about that you'd like to add, that you'd like to share?
I think it would probably be wise to stop.
In which case, thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you both.
Thank you very much.